The Halo series is certainly an interesting one. Sure, it's got a storied history and a mountain of lore, but the games themselves are pretty inconsistent in terms of quality. Even so, Halo Combat Evolved is considered by many to have the best campaign in the entire series. When the game launched in 2001, it was universally acclaimed, and it's still loved to this day. But as a guy in his early 20s who didn't get into the Halo series until long after that, I went back to try Halo CE to see if it holds up to the standards established by later games in the series, as well as standards established for modern shooters in general. But after playing through the campaign, twice in fact, I don't have much positive to say about it. In fact, I consider Halo CE to be one of the most overrated games I've ever played. I'm going to be breaking down this campaign bit by bit and showing why I don't enjoy it nearly as much as most of you probably do. So let's jump right into this, starting with the story of Halo CE. The story begins with the Master Chief being woken up from cryosleep to defend the Pillar of Autumn from Covenant borders. He takes a stroll around the room while two random Marines babysit him because apparently going into cryosleep makes you forget how to walk. The Chief fights well, but the Autumn is overrun despite this, forcing the crew to flee the ship via lifeboats and crash land on the ring-like structure below. After Chief rounds up some scattered Marines, Cortana tells him that Jacob Keyes, the captain of the Pillar of Autumn, was captured by Covenant troops in the chaos, necessitating a rescue mission. Come nightfall, the Marines make their way to the Covenant ship Keyes is being held on, the Truth and Reconciliation. They use the ship's anti-gravity lift to get inside, and Chief locates the brig and busts Keyes out. It's a mystery to me as to why the Covenant troops inside the ship didn't just, disable the anti-gravity lift to prevent the Marines from getting inside, but I guess the Covenant isn't being run by especially competent leadership at this point. After being rescued, Keyes tells Chief and Cortana he overheard some Covenant troops talking about something called Halo, a massive super weapon that could wipe out humanity in short order if the Covenant is able to find it. To prevent this, Chief and Cortana need to find something known as the Silent Cartographer, a map that holds the location of Halo's control room, the only place the weapon can be activated from. After disabling security, they reach the Cartographer and they learn the location of Halo's control room. Once there, Cortana is blown away by the sheer amount of knowledge in the control room servers, so much so that even the Chief can't keep up.
Wait. No, that can't be. Oh, those Covenant fools. They must have known. There must have been signs.
Slow down. You're losing me.
Don't worry, Chief. The story's losing me too. Cortana tells Chief he needs to go find Captain Keyes immediately because the Captain isn't privy to the information she is and he's about to make a critical mistake. It's worth noting Captain Keyes can't be contacted remotely since his comms are conveniently not working, but I don't know, let's just chalk another one up for plot convenience. The Chief asks for more clarification, but Cortana just yells at him to go. Remember that Cortana didn't clarify anything to the Chief here, it will be important later. Chief heads to Keyes' last known location to find him, but the only thing he discovers is a helmet belonging to a Marine named Jenkins. Chief watches the recording on the device attached to Jenkins' helmet and learns that Keyes and his escort were attacked by some strange-looking creatures that aren't of Covenant origin. The creatures then return and attack the Chief en masse, forcing him to fight his way back to the surface for extraction, although he's unable to be picked up due to the dense fog. Even though the Pelican dropped Chief off earlier with the same amount of fog present. That doesn't end up being too big of an issue though, since a random orb shows up out of absolutely nowhere and teleports the Chief to safety Deus Ex style. The orb introduces himself as 343 Guilty Spark, monitor of the Halo installation, and he tells the Chief the creatures that attacked him before are known as the Flood, a parasitic species that assimilates other living organisms of sufficient biomass and transforms them into more vessels for the parasite. Spark also informs the Chief that the only way to stop the Flood from spreading is to return to Halo's control room and use the ring's defenses to wipe out the parasite. Chief makes his way back there, but is stopped from activating Halo by Cortana, who angrily tells him that Halo isn't designed to kill the Flood itself, but rather kill the Flood's food source by eliminating all sentient life in the galaxy and starving the parasite to death in the process. Cortana also scolds the Chief for blindly going along with what Spark was telling him to do, but honestly I think this screw-up is on both of them. Sure, Chief was really dumb for trusting Spark without a justifiable reason, but Cortana was also really dumb for not telling the Chief more information about what was going on when the two initially reached the control room. Cortana even says this after getting there.
You alright?
Never been better. You can't imagine the wealth of information. The knowledge, so much, so fast. It's glorious.
So I meant to believe Cortana learned so much information she was literally overwhelmed by it, but she didn't learn anything about the Monitor, the Flood, or the Index? Because if not, then she didn't learn that much information, and if she did learn about these things, why didn't she tell the Chief? Anyway, moving on. Once the Chief changes course and refuses to activate Halo, Spark betrays him and orders Halo's defense robots, the Sentinels, to kill the Chief and take Cortana for Spark's purposes. And let's just say the Chief is not too happy about that.
Still, I must have the index. Give your construct to me, or I will be forced to take her from you.
That's not going to happen.
So be it. Save his head. Dispose of the rest.
After Chief escapes the Monitor's clutches, Cortana proposes a plan to return to the Pillar of Autumn and activate its self-destruct sequence to blow up the Halo ring and prevent it from being activated. In order to do this, though, Chief needs to find Keyes because Cortana needs information contained within Keyes' neural implant to override the Autumn's security protocols. Using the signal from Keyes' implant, Chief is able to track him down, but he's too late to help Keyes as he's already been assimilated by the Flood and turned into one of, well, whatever the hell that is. Chief channels his inner Mike Tyson and punches a hole straight through Keyes' face to get the neural implant out. Chief and Cortana then return to the Autumn via a stolen Covenant Banshee that spontaneously breaks down near the end of the trip. I guess the writers really wanted to include another crash somewhere and couldn't think of anywhere else to put one. They reach the bridge, but they're stopped from activating the ship's self-destruct protocol by none other than 343 Guilty Spark, who's back for round 2 after tracking them from Halo's control room. Cortana devises a backup plan to blow up the Autumn's fusion reactors to circumvent Spark, and after doing the job, Chief escapes the Halo ring just before the Autumn explodes using an abandoned longsword left on the ship, starting an insane trend of the Master Chief being the luckiest man in human history. Cortana despairs, thinking about the Marines who were left for dead due to the collapse of the ring, but reassures herself they did what they had to do. She tells the Chief that the threat of the Halo rings is over, but the Chief himself isn't so sure, setting up a slew of sequels with stories way more interesting than the one this game offers. As far as the quality of this story is concerned, I just don't think it's that great. There aren't too many moments that really stand out, and the whole thing just feels like one big blur where nothing is really happening. Sure, crash landing on the Halo ring is kinda cool, and seeing the Flood for the first time is a nice change of pace, albeit one that doesn't last very long due to some issues I'll get more into later. But despite both of those things, there's very little content actually here. You land on the ring, you fight the Covenant, you fight the Flood, and then you leave, and that's all there is to it. On top of that, several events within the story only happen because of justifications that are paper thin. If Captain Keyes remembered to turn on his comms, the Chief could have just radioed Keyes to tell him not to enter the structure, and then the Chief wouldn't have needed to chase him down. It's a lazy writing decision that just serves to drag out the story. If Cortana had access to the Autumn self-destruct permissions herself, she could have just detonated the ship without needing Keyes. But of course that's not the case because only Keyes has the required info, meaning Chief has to chase Keyes down again. This game has a huge problem with dragging things out, but I'll get into that way more once I start discussing the level design. I'm sorry guys, but this story is just not good. It's not well written, it's bland, it's repetitive, and it doesn't provide any sense of satisfaction while experiencing it. It misses the mark in so many areas, and the characters themselves unfortunately aren't much better. Of all the characters here, Chief is the only one I don't really have anything negative to say about. He's your average run-of-the-mill quiet protagonist, but he says enough to get the job done. His character isn't anything groundbreaking, but I won't deny that Chief had a few lines in this game that made me smile. Cortana, on the other hand, is a different story. She spends the majority of her time telling you things that are painfully fucking obvious.
Alert! Covenant dropship inbound. They must be looking for survivors. I recommend immediate evasion.
or spouting random military jargon that isn't interesting in the slightest.
5th Platoon, secure airlocks on Deck 11. 14th Platoon, rendezvous with 22nd Tactical at Bulkhead Charlie 14.
It gets to a point where you just want her to shut the hell up so you can focus on what you're doing, because she's often telling you things you don't need to be told, or vice versa. Her character is done so much better in later games. Except for Halo Infinite, her character's pretty garbage there too. Captain Keyes is as dry as a bone in this story. He's an incredibly generic ship captain whose character is way too weak and inconsequential to justify the amount of narrative attention given to him. Nothing else to say about him, moving on. Echo 419 is Chief's exclusive Pelican taxi service, or at least that's how she's portrayed. She also dies in the last mission of the game, which I might have bothered to care about if she was anything other than a disembodied voice who yells at the Chief on occasion. Moving on to the Covenant, this is probably where the biggest boat was missed in terms of character development. There's barely any context given for the Covenant in this game. It's unclear who they really are or what they really want besides they want to activate the ring. Okay, but why? What's the end goal? The Covenant feels more like a generic group of enemies that exist just so the Master Chief has someone to fight, rather than an organized group operating from a unique perspective, something that's shown way better in later games. The shortcomings of the story might not be so bad if the characters themselves were more developed and more interesting, but their shortcomings just expose the story's problems more. But that's the story and characters out of the way. Neither came close to reaching my expectations given the sheer amount of praise this game has received over the years, but does Halo CE at least stack up in the gameplay department? Let's take a deep dive into that now. Fundamentally, Halo CE functions as a standard sci-fi/military shooter. You begin a level and your primary goal is to shoot shit up until you reach the end, plain and simple. Let's start with the Chief himself. His movement speed is pretty solid, not exceptionally fast, but he also doesn't crawl forward at a snail's pace, so I think a happy medium was established here. Although jumping leaves a lot to be desired, as Chief's jump is both short and stiff, making platforming really inconsistent in some places. Chief's crouch is also annoying, since moving the stick fully in any direction while crouching causes the Chief to automatically stand up, regardless of whether you push the crouch button again or not. I know that doesn't sound like a big deal, but having Chief constantly stand up in the middle of the fight when you don't want him to is a really good way to get killed. The melee in this game is alright. I like the strength of it, but the animations are pretty slow to execute, leaving you open for an annoyingly long amount of time if you don't kill your target. As for the guns, they're pretty alright to use as well, despite the really small weapon sandbox. The assault rifle is the weapon you'll probably spend the most time using due to its fast firing rate and large magazine. It emphasizes a heavy spray and pray mentality most players will get a kick out of. The pistol is a fast killing weapon if you're landing headshots, making it a nice option against jackals, grunts, and even elites once their shields are down. Even so, it's not the best without having another weapon to properly supplement it. The sniper rifle is obviously ideal for long-range engagements, but I never really felt inclined to use it that much, save for the first portion of the third mission. This is a good time to mention that Flood combat forms are effectively immune to the sniper rifle. Can I ask why? I have yet to hear a single satisfactory explanation for that. The shotgun is your best friend for dealing with Flood combat forms, since it can one-shot them at close range pretty consistently, along with melting just about anything else through sustained fire. The rocket launcher is great for taking out vehicles and clearing out large hordes of enemies, but the collision detection for it feels a bit off. There are times where I swear my shot should have connected and it just didn't. It's also pretty easy to blow yourself up with it, but hey, it's a rocket launcher, so what do you expect? The plasma rifle is great for taking out shields quickly, and it's a pretty well-rounded weapon to use in a pinch, although it overheats pretty quickly, punishing you pretty hard if you fire it for really long intervals. Its little brother, the plasma pistol, is a shield-killing weapon as well, albeit useless for just about anything else. The Needler, on the other hand, is not so great. The needles move so slowly that they'll often curve around and miss your target, even if you're firing over a pretty short distance. On top of that, the number of needles required for a super detonation is pretty high, so combined with the slow speed of the needles, expect to burn through your ammo pretty damn fast while using this thing. On to the vehicles. Long story short, they're pretty annoying, but I'll break down each one quickly. The Warthog is fine once you get going, but it takes forever to pick up speed, and turning is really inconsistent. Sometimes you turn on a dime, sometimes you don't. The Ghost is a smaller, more nimble Covenant vehicle, well suited for navigating small passageways, although its lack of a boost functionality hinders its biggest advantages. Those being speed and maneuverability, since the Ghost has a bit of an acceleration problem just like the Warthog does, although I'd argue not as severe. The Scorpion is a pain in the ass to use in this game. Its slow acceleration is to be expected because, well, it's a tank. But the Scorpion's biggest problem is how the aiming system works. Unlike later games in the series where its movement and aiming axes function independently of one another, they are locked together in this game. This means you will almost always be forced into making a decision between attacking enemies and avoiding incoming fire, since attempting to do both at once just leads to the Scorpion fighting against you and locking in place. During the first of my 2 playthroughs of this campaign, I abandoned the Scorpion way before you're meant to on multiple occasions because I was just so frustrated with how it controls. It's the worst vehicle in the game, easily. The Banshee is the only aerial vehicle you get to use, but unfortunately it has a flaw of its own. Unlike in later games, it has no constant velocity pushing it forward, so making a series of turns in rapid succession causes it to drop like a rock. The lack of a constant velocity makes it great for sitting in one place and picking off enemies from above, but I don't recommend doing that often unless you want to be a sitting duck for incoming fire. Vehicles are also pretty brittle, as even small barrages of enemy fire can tear a Ghost, Warthog, or Banshee into pieces within a matter of seconds. You also can't run over enemies with vehicles in this game, at least not with a Ghost since that's the only vehicle I tried it with. Don't worry though, enemies can damn sure run you over, and pretty easily at that, since the Master Chief's armor is made out of tissue paper in this game. Seriously, why does the Chief die instantly when a vehicle grazes him at 2 miles an hour? It's a massive immersion killer when I'm supposed to be playing as a fully augmented super soldier with a suit of armor weighing half a ton and sporting its own shield system, but I fall over like a wet noodle after taking an impact a bunny could walk away from. And speaking of immersion killers, what the hell is going on with the fall damage in this game? I swear if you fall from a height of more than 15 feet, you're basically screwed. And the problem translates to vehicles as well, since bailing out of a vehicle with any sort of speed is a guaranteed death wish if you're more than 5 feet above the ground. These oversights are so annoying because they knock you out of the experience so hard when they happen. Okay, now that we've covered how the shooting works, let's talk about who you're going to be shooting. We'll start with the Covenant. The elites are the backbone of the Covenant's fighting force, as they are very intelligent and easily the biggest threat you'll face when encountered in large numbers. They actively avoid your shots when you attempt to fire at them, and Sword elites, despite being a one-hit kill at close range, pose a dangerous but fair challenge. If you can anticipate their movements, they aren't too difficult to take down. Jackals are much quicker than elites, and they carry large shields to protect themselves against frontal attacks, encouraging you to either flank them or use grenades. I'd say they're pretty well balanced. Grunts function primarily as cannon fodder. They're not really a threat on their own until they start packing fuel rod guns in the later levels of the game. And shooting them in the head with a Grunt birthday party skull active always yields great results. Never gets old. The only Covenant enemy I consider to be poorly done in this game is the Hunters. They're meant to be big tank-like enemies that are really difficult to kill without heavy weapons. But they're actually the exact opposite, since they can be killed with one shot to the back from either a pistol or sniper rifle, making them total pushovers that are really unsatisfying to fight against. As a whole though, I don't really mind fighting the Covenant that much. The Flood, on the other hand, are an entirely different story. I won't mince words here. I hate fighting the Flood in this game, and I mean I really hate it. There are 2 major problems that make fighting the Flood absolutely unbearable. First, their spawns are terrible. Flood combat forms will often spawn and charge at you from 2, even 3 directions at once. This makes fighting them aneurysm-inducing, as you will constantly get sandwiched between massive hordes of enemies you cannot possibly hope to kill quickly enough to survive. One might suggest using grenades to take them out quickly, and that works fine in open areas, but when you're fighting in tight corridors such as those found in Keys, the Library, and 343 Guilty Spark, tossing around grenades with reckless abandon is a great way to get yourself killed, especially given the large blast radius of grenades in this game. Beyond that, some flood forms are positioned in such a way that you will round a corner directly into them with little to no time to react. They come out of the walls, they come out of the ceilings, they come from everywhere, and they force you to constantly have your head on a swivel, and not in a good way. The second problem with the Flood is that they are massive bullet sponges. If you have to go up against a large number of Flood combat forms without a shotgun and/or grenades, you are going to be in serious trouble, since the enemies will either tank all of your shots, sealing your fate, or the massive number of enemies you're forced to deal with will overwhelm you even if you are using a weapon with a decent time to kill. And it doesn't help that Flood combat forms, on top of being immune to the sniper rifle as I mentioned earlier, are effectively immune to melee attacks as well, severely limiting your options when fighting them. Fighting the Flood is an absolute chore, and it's a huge reason why the second half of the campaign is such a huge slog. But would you believe me if I said, despite all the things I've covered so far, we haven't even reached the biggest issue in this campaign yet? The level design is undoubtedly the worst problem for Halo CE, easily worse than the issues with the story, characters, and gameplay. In fact, I'd say it's worse than all of those issues combined. Let's start from the top. Remember how I said this game has a huge problem with dragging things out when I was discussing the story? That problem extends to the level design, but it's amped up tenfold. It cannot be overstated when I say this game has more copy-pasted level design than any other shooter game I've played in my entire life. Now, to be fair, not every single environment in the game has this problem. There are locations in this game that are genuinely interesting to explore. I enjoy the grassy hills and open plains in the mission Halo, as well as the beaches in Silent Cartographer. I also like the dark and creepy swamp at the beginning of 343 Guilty Spark, although the density of the fog makes it impossible to see anything more than 10 inches in front of your face. But I am not being hyperbolic when I say that you will spend at least 70% of your total game time trekking through the same handful of interiors that are copy-pasted a ridiculous number of times. Copy-pasted rooms, copy-pasted hallways, copy-pasted corridors, copy-pasted elevators, copy-pasted everything. And the natural result of this is that levels overstay their welcome because they're way too fucking long. Assault on the Control Room took me nearly an hour to finish, and that wouldn't be such a bad thing if not for 60% of the level featuring the same repetitive areas that are copy-pasted over and over and over again. It just leads to a sense of boredom because you're left sitting there wondering, when is this level going to end? And what makes this even worse is that the rampant copy-paste level design doesn't stop at reusing areas within a single mission. In several cases, entire portions of a level are copied and placed into a different level. 2 Betrayals is literally the same level as Assault in the Control Room. The only differences are that you go through it backwards and it's nighttime instead of daytime. So not only do you have to put up with this disgustingly repetitive level design, you have to do it across stages which boost the feeling of deja vu even more. The Maw is just a repeat of the Pillar of Autumn with the addition of a really long and drawn out sequence featuring infinitely spawning Flood combat forms and a really annoying escape sequence with the Warthog. Keys reuses huge chunks of level design from the third mission, the Truth and Reconciliation. This level design is an absolute joke, and it drags the game down beyond any hope of redemption. The terrible level design also yields plenty of where the hell do I go moments. Because everything looks the same, it is very easy to get confused and waste time wandering around the area with no idea where to go or what to do to proceed. Look at this area in the mission 343 Guilty Spark. I got lost here for I don't know how long. How in the hell am I meant to figure out where to go here? When you play this game for the first time, you are going to get lost in most of these levels at least once. And do you want to know how I know the developers expected the majority of players to get lost? Because they stuck these big-ass blue arrows on the floors throughout multiple levels. I'm sorry, but a game with good level design doesn't need to do this. The game should naturally show the player the correct way to go with level design that is interesting and, more importantly, unique. To address another issue, some levels have objectives that aren't nearly as clear as they should be. In the second mission of the game, there's a point where you need to find a way to activate a light bridge to move forward. I wandered around this area for several minutes with no idea how to activate the bridge, my frustration increasing with each passing second. Turns out, the switch to activate the bridge is way off to the side, and the only indicator the game gives you is a very faint green light in the distance that is very easy to miss if you aren't scanning every pixel of the screen. In the mission keys, there's a point where you need to jump down into a pool of liquid to continue. But given everything the game has taught me about fall damage up to this point, I wasn't exactly eager to take the plunge. On my first playthrough of this game, I actually backtracked because I just assumed I wasn't meant to go this way and that I needed to find another route. There's nothing that really clues you into the fact that you can survive this jump. Cortana even says this once you reach the jump.
Analyzing damage. This hole was caused by some kind of explosive. Very powerful if it tore through the ship's hull. All I detect down there are pools of coolant. We should continue our search somewhere else.
So what gives? These counterintuitive situations are just another reason why the level design fails. To some, it might seem like I'm complaining about the level design too much, but I really want to make it clear how big of a problem it is because it is the nail in the coffin for Halo CE's campaign. As much as I dislike the story and characters along with viewing the gameplay as a mixed bag, I might have been able to overlook some of those things and still enjoy the game if the level design wasn't so damn terrible. It's just too many things piling on at once. Halo CE might have been an amazing game in 2001, but looking back at it 20 years later, it just doesn't hold up. The campaign is full of head-scratching design decisions and careless oversights that drag it down way more than its die-hard fanbase is willing to admit. If you want to play a Halo game with a campaign actually worth your time, I recommend Halo 2, Halo 3, and Halo Reach as the top 3 candidates, since all 3 of those games don't waste your time with a campaign that tries to be way longer than it needs to be. Halo Combat Evolved's campaign earns a happy, healthy 4 out of 10. There is not a lot of good content here, and the game is far, far outclassed by its sequels. Hey everyone, if you made it this far, that means you watched the video all the way to the end. Thanks so much for watching. It took me a really long time to make this, and I really appreciate you listening to everything I had to say. If you agree with a lot of the things I said about Halo CE, head down to the comments and let me know about it. If you don't agree, that's cool too. Head down to the comments and tell me why. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.